Welcome you all. Thanks for, again, a nice attendance from a wide diversity of groups and organisations. Firstly, thanks to our panellists. I won't go through them all, other than to thank Linda Fox-Rogers for chairing, Anne Graham from the CEO of the NTA, and Shane Timmons for the ESRI, Simon Mooney and Finbarr Brereton, both from UCD. I'm not going to go through their bios. Linda's going to chair the event and introduce everyone formally. But thanks very much for coming, and I'll hand over to Linda now. So Linda Fox-Rogers, who's Assistant Professor in Planning at UCD. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Eoin. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Eoin, for inviting me to chair this afternoon's proceedings. It's really exciting to be here. So we have a action-packed afternoon, I suppose. We're going to be having presentations from Dr Finbarr Brereton and Dr Simon Mooney from UCD. And the topic of their presentation today is expert advice on the environment. And they'll be focusing on people's willingness to engage in climate mitigation activities in urban areas. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the particular focus is on transport policy. So Dr Finbarr Brereton is a lecturer and head of environmental policy in UCD's School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. He's an environmental economist with a PhD on topics of quality of life and the economics of happiness. And in addition to Finbarr's involvement in this EU-funded Peritia project, which he's going to speak about today, much of Finbarr's recent research is focused on people's perceptions of and behavioural responses to environmental externalities caused by natural hazards and human activities. And joining Finbarr today is Dr Simon Mooney, who's a postdoctoral researcher in UCD's School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. Simon is a qualified urban planner, having graduated from UCD with a Masters in Regional and Urban Planning. And Simon also holds a PhD from TUD in the broad area of environmental risk communication and behavioural promotion. We're also really delighted today to have two external panellists joining us. We have Anne Graham, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the National Transport Authority. Prior to taking on the role of CEO in 2015, Anne served as the NTA's Director of Public Transport Services, and she's previously worked in the Dublin local authorities as a chartered civil engineer, as a project manager, and as an area manager in the southwest area of the city. Anne is an engineering graduate from UCD and TCD, and she's a chartered engineer. She also holds an MBA in local government from DCU and a Masters of Engineering, Science and Transport from UCD. And we're delighted to have you here, Anne. Thanks for giving up your time. We are also joined by Dr Shane Timmons, who's a Senior Research Officer in the ESRI's Behavioural Research Unit. Shane holds a PhD in psychology and a postgraduate certificate in certificates from TCD. And the present focus of Shane's research is on how individuals and systems interact in ways that have implications for climate policy. Shane's work within the Behavioural Research Unit seeks to inform policy development and implementation using research methods from behavioural science, primarily on projects relating to the environment and consumer decision making. So we're really delighted to have you both here, and we very much look forward to hearing your comments on the presentation. So just maybe to give you an idea of the structure, we're going to have our presentations from Simon and Finbarr. I think in the opposite direction. Finbarr is going to introduce the project, and then we're going to have 15 minutes or so of a presentation from Simon, who's going to deliver the key project findings. And then after that, we'll invite both Shane and Anne to give your comments, your feedback on the project, roughly 5 minutes or so, I believe is what we've accounted for. And then we should have about 25 minutes or so to open up the floor to general questions and answers. I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting thoughts and discussion and debate. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Finbarr, maybe to kick us off with the presentation. And of course, I should say we will be having refreshments and lunch at the end, most importantly.
Just check my clicker works. Yeah. So great, thank you very much, Linda, for the introductions, and everyone here today for coming. Great to see such interest in the room. So this is a wider project that I certainly can't take credit for, the Peritia project. I'll say a little bit about that a little bit later on, looking at policy, expertise, and trust. So that was the main topics of Peritia. What myself and Simon were involved in is a much smaller part of that much bigger project, looking at trust in environmental expertise. And we had excellent colleagues in King's College London, Sense About Science, and across Europe as well. So I definitely have to give them credit So what were we interested in this project? So we know that expertise is crucial for policy making. So experts provide the evidence base for decision making, for policy. But how do the general public interact, engage with, accept or not that expertise? Does the type of expert matter? Does the engagement matter? Does the delivery of that expertise matter? And this is what myself and Simon are going to talk about today. So to give you a little bit of context that probably most of you or maybe even none of you in the room need any explanation. We are in the middle of a climate crisis. So we have very stringent targets from the European Union in terms of where we need to get to. We, of course, had the EU climate and energy package out to 2020. And so we achieved that 20% reduction in emissions out to 2020. But the targets are getting much more stringent and much more difficult to reach. So we have a 55% reduction by 2030. And of course, that goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. So this idea that Europe is going to be a carbon neutral continent by 2050. So it's a very, very ambitious task. There is a range of EU policy, law, etc. around this, mandating that we as member states have to reach our targets. People will be familiar with the EU Green Deal and, of course, the recent climate law as well. So that's at the EU level. Then when you focus in at the member state, the national level, our own government, etc. So I've picked out a range of different transport-related documents, policies, etc. Here in this slide. So we have the programme for government. We have the climate action plan out to 2020. We have the NTA has released certain strategies for the greater Dublin area. So this puts us on the pathway to carbon neutrality in the transport sector. But that is going to take very, very, very stringent, very, very difficult behavioural change. So people will have to change their behaviour to meet the targets that have been set out in these documents. Hence, we need engagement with the public or publics. And how do we do that? How do we go about engaging with the public? So there's been quite a number of initiatives recently. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Citizen Assembly on climate change and the recommendations that came out of that. There's a national dialogue on climate action, climate conversations, and of course the climate change in the Irish Mind, recently published by the Environmental Protection Agency. So these documents, these processes are trying to see what is the level of knowledge around climate change among the general public, and then what is the willingness to act in terms of climate change. Are the public willing to act in terms of changing their behaviour to address climate change? I'll just give you some statistics, some information from those particular documents. This isn't our information. This is from those documents. Worry, concern about climate change fluctuates. It fluctuates over time. The top figure is from 2022, the National Dialogue on Climate Action, and we see 68% of people very worried about climate change. And then in 2004, quite recently, we have, I think it's 34% very worried about climate change. So we have fluctuations in terms of concern about climate change. The figure on the other side, that looks at when is climate change going to harm society. And we can see that the consensus among the general public is that this is going to happen to future generations or people very far away. But right at the bottom of that graph, you'll see individually much less in terms of impact on the general public. So this perception that climate change, yes, it is happening, and we recognise that it's happening, but far away to people are very, very far in the future, but not so much on the individual. And then in terms of who should take action in terms of climate change, so the government is mentioned, the European Union is mentioned, industry is mentioned, but again, at the bottom of the graph, you'll see the individual. So there's less onus on the individual to take action. And then the graph on the other side, I took from the Irish Times yesterday. They're online interactive graphs. They're really nice. And again, these are snapshots in time. They do change, they do fluctuate. But in terms, we have election coming up in terms of local elections and European elections. So what is on the mind of the public in terms of what they're going to vote vote about. And we'll see housing, immigration at the top of that. And I think if you can see in the blue, somewhere in the middle, climate and sustainability, 2%. So again, it fluctuates, definitely fluctuates over time. But when you knock at the door and ask what the general public is worried about in terms of the elections, sustainability and climate change tend to be lower on the on their agenda. So it is quite difficult in the context of polycrises. We have an energy crisis, we have a war in Ukraine and Gaza, we have a cost of living crisis. So it's hard to keep climate change at the top of an agenda in terms of the general public. That doesn't mean that we still don't need to meet our targets. So we have very, very stringent sectoral emissions targets that we need to achieve by 2030. This is from a recent EPA report, which suggests we're going to miss those targets in every sector. So across sectors, we're going to miss our targets. I'm going to generalize a little bit in terms of this particular table, but in terms of the behavioral change among the general public that's required in terms of electricity, we can shift from fossil fuels to renewables. But when you turn your light on at home, the lights still go on. So there's minimal behavior change in terms of electricity. In terms of buildings, that chain would be very, very familiar with. You get a short-term pain for long-term gain. So you get a more energy efficient house, you get cheaper bills, you get a more comfortable dwelling. In terms of industry, the general public sees that as someone else's problem. But transport, this is where we're really going to need behavioral change. I think it was yourself, Anne, in a recent document who said that society will need to accelerate that change towards more active travel, towards cycling, walking, and public transport. And so this is where we come in, or where our project came in. So very, very, very briefly about Karatia, led by a colleague of mine in UCD, Maria Bag-Ramian, in the UCD School of Philosophy. So she's an expert on trust and all things trust. She led the project. So looking at understanding public trust in expertise, why do we trust experts? And looking at the conditions that affect trust in and trustworthiness of expert opinion. So we are in the year of elections. We are in the year of I think 2 billion people will vote in democratic elections. And we know democracy thrives on debate, disagreement, but science can sometimes be presented as undebatable, as facts. And I like this little cartoon. Hopefully you can read it. But I think it sums up that sometimes we as scientists think we have the answers. We think we know it all. Sometimes the general public is not convinced. Don't think so. And to give you an idea, so when you ask scientists, do they believe climate change is happening and what are the causes? There's 99% consensus that climate change is happening and that anthropogenic causes are what's driving it. If you ask the general public what they believe the consensus among scientists is between 20 and 30% they believe don't see climate change is happening, or that it's not caused by human actions. So that is a big difference between what the general public's consensus is and what the scientific consensus is in terms of climate change and the need to act. So we employ a trust framework. We have credibility, integrity. So these are the characteristics that people want to see in their experts before they trust them. And Simon will talk a little bit more about this. So competence, reputation, fairness, and intention. Does the expert have an agenda? And what we find is when any of these components are missing, people are less trusting of the expert and the information and the expertise as well. So to get to our approach and what we actually did. So last year in Dublin, we ran a one-day deliberative mini-public. Think of it as a mini citizens assembly. So a smaller type of citizens assembly. We had 31 participants who were recruited to quotas, so that we had a broad range of views, opinions of urban areas, of urban Dublin represented on the day. We had 3 experts. We had a journalist, an academic, and someone representing civil society who spoke to and interacted with our participants on the day. Lots of different discussions and plenaries, etc. And then we had a pre and post workshop survey that gave the attitudes to climate change and climate change information before and after our deliberative mini-public. And so we focused on what urban transport policy changes with an impact on their lifestyles are citizens prepared to accept in the context of climate change. So very, very much around urban transport and urban transport policy. So we employed the framework or the process of the Citizens' Assembly, but we focused very much in the lens was very much on trust and expertise. We did the other parts, the policy recommendations, etc., but we really focused on trust, the trust in the expertise, the expert themselves, and the information that they presented. So our central question: can participation between experts and the public enhance trust in the expertise used by policymakers? And the workshop structure, I won't say too much about this. This is my last slide before I pass on to Simon. So we looked at initial thoughts about the climate crisis, so concern and willingness to act, perceptions of people addressing climate change. So who should take the burden? Then we had our three academic presentations: a prominent academic from Dublin, a prominent journalist in a broadsheet newspaper, and then a very high profile seen in the media a lot, NGO representative who came and talked to our panelists as well. And then we had generation and prioritization of recommendations as well. And at this point, I will pass on to my colleague Simon, who will talk about the results on the day. Just right and left. Yep.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'll try not to go too over time. There are a lot of quotes, but people had a lot to say, and I think it behooves me to capture what was said on the day. So hopefully I can stay on time. So I'll start off in terms of levels of concern about climate change and adjustments relatively briefly. So just to draw from the baseline survey, before the DMP actually commenced, we gave participants a short survey to fill out, and then there was also a post-workshop survey as well. So respondents typically claimed low knowledge about climate change, moderate knowledge about national policy responses, and moderate concern about personal impacts. And the majority also believed climate change was currently harming the country now or would do so within a decade. So 80% of the cohort, which is fairly significant really. And the mean assumed level of scientific consensus was 72.2%, which is quite fascinating because, as most of us know, it's 99% or more. That did change. I'll get to that in the future. And also moderate cited use of public transport walking, but far more limited instances of donation to climate charities or voting for environmental parties as well, which is interesting just to get an idea of our participants and their views and where they're coming from. So in terms of climate change concern and how that was borne out in the actual DMP, we see that it is often expressed in relation to personal circumstance and perceived imminence of impacts. So, you know, how far ahead are they? Are they more imminent? Are they more distant in the future? First quote here, relatively blunt, but I think it does kind of capture it really. I don't have any kids, so it's not on my radar. Maybe there's not that affect for purely selfish reasons because I don't have any kids or whatever. Then the second quote, more concerned about future generations. So again, there's an awareness that it's happening, but maybe that the worst impacts are further ahead on the horizon. And also psychological distancing and visibility was massive. It cropped up in every table. Maybe because I don't see it on a day-to-day basis. I don't see it in Ireland. And interestingly enough, in the baseline survey, some people who cited high concern tended to have maybe an anecdotal instance or a personal observation, maybe a holiday abroad where they saw the worst manifestations of extreme weather events. They noticed differences in air quality, abatement of asthma, and they were actually able to relate that back to climate change, which is interesting. Also, in terms of adjustments, EV stands for electric vehicle. So a few people conjecturally, yeah, in a few years maybe, but in terms of what was happening now, incremental household measures really. So not actively reading about it, learning about it, other than the general household recycling. Also what was interesting, some fatalistic sentiments apparent, looking at countries such as China, maybe a disposition to blame it on the kind of more obvious culprits are the ones that you typically see in the media. Take China, they've got more than 1 billion people. You could be killing yourself and not make a drop in the ocean, although there was somewhat of a shift in this as the DMPs went on. And also transport was widely accepted as a significant contributor to climate change, which is interesting. In terms of information acquisition, so how do people happen upon information? So is it push information? Do they just kind of come across it when they're watching the news, or is it stuff they're seeking out? So in terms of modes of acquisition, traditional news media, so your broadsheets, your primetime news, the most frequently referenced source of information, particularly among participants in middle adulthood or older age, as you may expect. Social media platforms more popular among young adults. They're not exclusively. There are a few older people who mentioned maybe having an Instagram feed, Greenpeace, or maybe on Twitter. So it wasn't across the board. And interestingly enough, of those who claim to have recently paid attention to climate change information, that is within the last month, 90% cited high to medium concern about personal climate change impacts. So this sunburst chart here kind of captures it. And it's kind of an interesting question. Are they seeking out this information because they're concerned? Or is it kind of vice versa? But we do see a kind of interesting trend when we looked at that baseline survey data, that people who did have that kind of recent exposure tended to be more concerned, which I think is fascinating. That has interesting implications. In terms of who people preferred, the majority of participants actually neglected charities or NGOs as organizational surges, with legacy traditional media usually preferred, and that will crop up again in subsequent slides. Older male participants were by far the most reluctant and skeptical in terms of social media. Younger people felt they were able to maybe parse through it and identify distrustful sources, but older people were far more trenchant in their views. So the concerns about the algorithms, just avoiding it outright and maybe opting for more traditional media. Then in terms of trust and climate change information, it did heavily center around reliability and impartiality of information. Impartiality was huge, particularly among older participants. So provision of empirical evidence, facilitation of opposing viewpoints, reflexivity. So for instance, if you have an expert from an NGO or from academia, they're able to adjust the lens or the frame of reference and maybe take into account other views, why people think the way they do. And presentation of substantive regional case studies came through again and again, because maybe the most obvious or tangible manifestations of climate change, we don't always see it in Ireland. We're relatively insulated when it comes to certain risks and certain manifestations of those risks. And concerns about lack of balance were strongest among older respondents. My opinion is not foreign for education of the media. So although they're taking in that information from media, maybe they're not seeing it all the time. Maybe it's just from what I see. So they're not seeing it. They're not seeing the worst manifestations of it. The visibility of scientists in media was regarded as a big signifier of trustworthiness. And interestingly enough, some people mentioned that it's typically podcasts where you see most of this, that it's not readily available. If you turn on EcoEye and RTE, you might see it every now and again, but it's not constant, which again is fascinating. So attribution of responsibility. So this was a badge exercise where we looked at 3 aspects of management in relation to climate change. So developing solutions, implementing solutions, and communicating risks. And respondents were asked to kind of select their top 3 out of a group of stakeholders. So I'll start off with developing solutions. So the most popular was the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and scientists, European Commission, EC also cropping up. Interestingly enough, citizens as well in that other column, they were kind of proposed, but they didn't make the final cut. But it's interesting to see industry crop up there 3 times as well. So in terms of scientists, their ability to formulate material changes, it was seen as their remit to develop solutions. In terms of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, seen as an intermediary really between scientists and policymakers, and the European Commission for their policy sway in Europe. Non-prioritized stakeholders, industries, which is seen as completely incongruous. They were seen as the problem. They were seen as being profit-based, so not particularly relevant. And also charities, linking back to NGOs here, scam. This recurred again and again. People associated NGOs with instances of fraud, instances of embezzlement. People cited stories from Haiti, for instance. So that was something that cropped up again and again, and it's of note. In terms of actually implementing solutions, we see industry crop up here massively, national government and the European Commission as well. Very fascinating to see citizens crop up 3 times, again proposed, but didn't make the final cut for all of those groups. So industries, very much a framing of culpability. They're responsible for most of it. Us citizens can't do anything, therefore it kind of lies at their door. The government have to implement it somewhat begrudgingly. It's not something they want to do. And of course, the European Commission's commitment and their influence in Europe came up again and again. And again, in terms of non-priority stakeholders, initially very much citizens, what can we do? We're kind of at a reserve. There's only so much we can do. It's not our issue. And lastly, communicating risk, which is interesting because this is where we saw the most variety in terms of people chosen. But educators came up again and again, and it was very much in the context of intergenerational learning and school teachers. So people latched on to the importance of schools, the importance of teaching children. And then briefly, this is from an older participant. I think it's important to acknowledge that for certain people, they didn't grow up with climate change in schools. So they might be concerned about it, they might acknowledge it, but they might lump it in with the zeitgeist. They might potentially see it as a fad, they might see it as overblown. So I think it's important to acknowledge this. Also, scientists very much salient here. If someone was talking to me and then I suddenly realized they were a scientist in climate change, I'd kind of skew to what they're saying. So broadly, we're kind of seeing confidence in science, maybe contrary to what we hear sometimes. In terms of non-priority stakeholders, again, we see NGOs. So kind of these news stories that people hear, a kind of skepticism there recurring again and again. And now to the actual expert presentation. So maybe before I get into the kind of the meat of this, I'll just go through our experts again briefly. So we had an academic, we had a journalist from a well-known broadsheet, and we also had an NGO representative. So I will start off with our. So praise for inclusion of charts and statistics. People very much latched on to the visual aspect, particularly those who were less knowledgeable. For instance, in relation to transport-derived greenhouse gases, that's GHGs. So the charts and things like that to show you exactly where all these fossil fuels are being burned. So it did actually lead to people pondering, do I actually need to get into the car? Can I walk? Seeing those stats did lead to some reflection. But there was a notable desire for more sector-specific information. So there was obviously an emphasis on transport in this particular expert's presentation. People wanted a more broad spread. Maybe there was some skepticism where they felt transport was being targeted because of the individual behavior change aspect. So people did maybe want to see other sectors as well. So for instance, agriculture, also wind power. And there's also some skepticism about the figures going up again. That's that bottom quote there. So are they counting long distance vehicles and taxis? So there was maybe a wish for more clarification in certain instances. The presentation did reinforce some concerns about infrastructural deficits, despite the expert actually noting the importance of behavior change. The actual presentation did focus heavily on infrastructure and existing deficits, which is quite fascinating. So it did solidify the idea for some people that we need to improve the existing system before we talk about wide-scale behavior change. And also among some of the older participants, or maybe those who latched onto the car very much, you did see a kind of perception of an anti-car message, and the experts' comparison between the Dublin of now to the Dublin of previous years or previous epochs, when you're going back potentially to the 20th century when you'd hovels, people thought it was maybe not the best kind of comparison to draw, but other people could kind of see the symbolic value, particularly some of the younger people, which was quite fascinating. And it was those younger participants and other participants with maybe not with young adult children or younger children who were more receptive and actually somewhat influenced the opinions of others. So you have these kind of micro dynamics happening in the tables as well. So the skepticism was most pointed among older participants, some who did believe there was a skewed agenda. So the notion that this person is coming with agenda, not seeing a whole lot of balance from an opposite point of view, that was something that some of the older participants flagged again and again. However, the expert was largely considered as trustworthy, so that academic background was considered a positive. So credibility of research, the sources coming from very credible agencies. Now on to the second expert two, the journalist, was the most favorite presentation on the day, and it was commended for the thematic scope. So planning, urban planning, transport infrastructure, that kind of breadth and depth of expertise was seen as very important, and people were very receptive to this. Despite mild criticism for lack of visuals, again, people very much like to actually see pictures and to see case studies. There were very few perceived flaws. The 15-minute concept, so that's the notion of having all of your amenities and all your major services within a 15-minute radius, drew very strong interest and endorsement, but it was viewed as unrealistic in the short to medium term. And it did bring some pretty strong themes of confidence in urban transport planning. So for instance, maybe if you bus Erin or you have a degree of public consultation to maybe hash out new bus routes, people felt that it was kind of rushed, a little bit tick box. Also, in terms of implications for private vehicle users, again, this kind of re-emerged, but it was a little less trenchant. It wasn't voiced by as many participants as the first expert. And you see these regional comparisons function as a jump-off point for discussion. So for instance, if you're looking at something like an annual transport pass in Vienna, that was big. Also some existing reflection in terms of existing habits and existing policies. CP participant 25 here from table 4 saying our thinking process as a country, there's maybe a feeling that we've kind of latched too heavily onto the idea of a motorized city. When you want to change transport, you have to change people's habits, and we are habitually driving. So an interesting piece of reflection there. In terms of trustworthiness, consider trustworthy for the vast majority of participants. So traits such as reflexivity, which I mentioned earlier, reputation, procedural knowledge, so how to actually put things into practice, and depth of knowledge frequently highlighted. So they came from it as a journalist as opposed to it's an agenda. There's also a feeling that because they work for a well-established broadsheet as a journalist, they don't have any ulterior motives. And again, that final quote, again, this aspect of reflexivity and maybe willing to criticize and step back and look at your particular industry or domain. They did say, don't believe everything you read in newspapers. Now, of course, they could be referring to tabloids, but still, I think this is something that participants very much appreciated. Next, our final expert, the NGO representative, was subjected to the greatest scrutiny, probably because of some of the strategies proposed, which I'll go through now briefly. So this particular representative proposed 3 strategies. So the first was increased provision of safe routes to school for cycling and walking. The second was expansion of the bike to work scheme, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So the idea was to expand that to €2,000 to accommodate e-bikes and e-scooters. And the last one, by far the most contentious, was the idea of implementing congestion charges on the canals into the city, which I will get into shortly. So in terms of what people wanted more from the presentation, some contingencies for those policy parameters, given what they would entail. So for instance, for those safe routes to school, for the expansion of the bike to work scheme, what are the implications in terms of increased use of e-bikes and e-scooters in terms of safety, what constitutes safety? Also, participant 25, so this related more to the congestion charges on the canal. So this notion that are you actually in fact moving a problem to somewhere else in terms of congestion? What are the logistics? What would this mean for disabled populations, for instance? So very much a desire to kind of look at those issues around dispensation, for instance. So inconvenience, public safety, spatial equity, all raised. So congestion charges were by far the most contested. However, interestingly enough, certain participants, maybe those who'd had an opinion previously swayed by a previous expert, or maybe who were younger or had children, they did tend to see the value in it a little bit more and believe that it was an effective or necessary measure. It would certainly make people think. It would maybe force people's hands because we're not going to be willing to give up our cars by ourselves. Also, again, considerable intergenerational debate between some older and some younger users, or participants rather, with the younger adults typically in favor. So transparency, this notion that we just have to make sacrifices because of where we are. So there was this perceived anti-car message again. And in terms of maybe evaluation of the information, how they liked it, how they liked how it was presented, they did think there was a somewhat partisan agenda and lack of reflexivity by the NGO representative. So this notion of saying as an advocate, you're coming here with an agenda, maybe potentially less willing to kind of step out of their frame of reference. They weren't able to, or they were perceived as being unable to answer a particular participant's question. However, we did see the reputation and the actual expert defended by some people. If you go back to the point I made about this kind of suspicion of NGOs and charities embezzlement, some participants flagged that immediately and also really felt that it almost colored the person who presented before they even said anything, but the reputation was defended by others. Interestingly enough, typically from younger female participants. So you have this idea of identification-based trust coming up here, whereas their values and principles might actually align with the expert. They're more likely to maybe trust them or to take them seriously. So this notion that it really seems to get you a bit more, the kind of positive aspects of the affect, so emotion, so maybe passion, the fact that someone is very much behind something. Also, again, the importance of schools was something that was spoken about quite a bit, and this was appreciated. So now to the final phase of DMPs, which is policy recommendations. So I'll just talk briefly about the expert policy proposal. So this is the NGO representative. And perhaps unsurprisingly, congestion charges on the canals by far the most contested, but they did see a little bit of support there. The bike to work scheme in the middle, in terms of how it was favored, maybe some of those concerns about safety around e-scooters, around how really would maybe come up here. Also, some people felt that it didn't raise the stakes enough from an incentive point of view. Urgent action to provide safe routes to school for cycling and walking is by far the most popular, and maybe because people felt that it was the easiest and most effective thing to do in the short term. However, to go back to the congestion charges on the canals briefly, it's important to note again that people could see the potential value going forward, and there was an admission from certain participants that we have to make sacrifices. In terms of individual policy proposals, maybe not the most novel, but there were some interesting suggestions nevertheless. Enhanced regularity and reliability of public transport, greater incentivization of public transport. So something such as an annual travel bus pass for a Dublin bus, maybe you would reduce the existing cost of the annual pass, for instance. Also improvements to existing infrastructure again. And I think this quote kind of captured it, the importance of changing mindsets. The best way to do that is to convince people that public transport is the best idea. The idea of giving them trust in the system, and that you give them that optionality, I think is the key word here. They will be willing to change behavior and actually adopt those behaviors and perhaps take the bus where they previously would not have done so. And so, of course, we can't forget about transport. We can't just focus on trust. So these are the things that came up the most, these 5 themes. So connectivity, every single table mentioned the fact that Dublin Airport doesn't have a light tram or rail system that connects into the city. It cropped up in every single table. So I felt I had to include it here. Also, in terms of financial cost, uptake of electric vehicles, there was a feeling that they were unaffordable. People also cited waiting lists, difficulties in acquiring first-hand versus second-hand cars. Also, in terms of public safety, electric scooters cropped up again and again. Something not included here, but something I'll allude to briefly, is concerns about safety at night in the city, particularly among female participants. One participant mentioned bringing her daughter to the Burgos Energy Theatre and then coming back in the Lewis and actually fearing for her life. So there were kind of worries about antisocial behaviour in the city as well. So I guess you could cast your mind back to certain occurrences that happened last year, and that maybe there was this kind of aspect of disquiet and unease about being in the city potentially. Also in terms of existing capacity, which is an interesting point to make. So let's say we have this uptake of urban transport tomorrow, would we have the capacity? Also lastly, in terms of efficiency. So these kind of little anecdotal stories about maybe relatives trying to get a bus, the bus not arriving, and then you have this potential kerfuffle and frustration and having to pick someone up. Now to the tail end, which I'll head back to the survey now briefly to see what actually shifted between the baseline survey and the post-deliberative mini-public workshop. So in terms of concern about climate change impacts, personally, we do see a pretty appreciable rise in terms of high concern. So I think that's fairly noticeable. In terms of somewhat concerned, you have a slight drop there, but there was a moderate increase in concern. In terms of perceived imminence of impact, not quite as pronounced, but you do see a slight increase in terms of people who thought that it was happening right now. In terms of knowledge about climate change, this is where you see one of the biggest leaps. So this notion of DMPs being edifying, that educational component, we did see that here. In terms of awareness of climate change actions, again, some moderate gains here. There was higher awareness, maybe not just because of the expert presentations of that was key, but maybe from what people heard from other participants. So that anecdotal aspect as well, that kind of almost secondary information transference. And very interesting, you'll recall that the mean assumed rate of scientific consensus was 72.2 in the baseline survey. So we had a far higher number of people who felt that it resided in the uppermost percentile, so 80 to 100% of scientists. So this notion of high agreement, far more in the post-workshop, which is quite interesting. Also in terms of personal agency in climate action, so fatalism, so this statement, is it just too difficult for someone like me to do much about climate change? If you look at the tend to disagree and strongly disagree from the post-workshop, you see quite an encouraging leap. And I'll just conclude here before I go into the key findings. So trust in stakeholders for information. So the pre-workshop mean, post-workshop mean, not very drastic differences. It actually depends on the stakeholder to some degree. You see a drop in government, you see a rise in media, you see a slight drop in trust in charities and NGOs, European Commission, trust in IPCC. They saw some of the biggest rises, and scientists actually remained quite stable, which is interesting, just a 0.1% increase. So key findings. So we did find that deliberative mini-publics do have some utility in terms of impacting knowledge, concern, and trust, although it does vary. So what was important about Dublin? So there were perceived infrastructural deficiencies. Public transport infrastructure in Dublin was viewed as lagging behind that of other European cities. People would talk about a European break, maybe noticing the difference. Provision of alternatives to driving cars in the city viewed as highly challenging, unsurprisingly. Belief that settlements were often built without consideration of commuter transport needs again. So the second expert who talked about the 15-minute city, that very much brought that issue to the fore. And in terms of policy acceptance, we did see something of an impasse. So the majority of participants stated that they would avail of improved public transport if it suddenly appeared, but would not be willing to curb existing behaviours in its absence. And we did see several participants across the tables, most notably younger participants and parents. They did believe or come to believe that there was an onus of responsibility. So personal circumstance, background, viewpoints, these things do have importance. And also in terms of what people latched onto the most in terms of trust. So impartiality, reflexivity, and breadth of knowledge were probably the biggest themes. And there was an example of a shift in mindset. So this participant from table one, this idea of kind of coming in, maybe seeing it as something we cannot impact in the immediate, that you could only make a drop in the ocean. Is our reaction to climate change going to make a difference? Then somebody else at our table asked the last speaker, can Ireland really make a difference in the world? And their response was, the richest countries need to be at the forefront. And this did lead to a shift in this person's viewpoint, that it's our actions in the global stage that will make a difference. So you do see examples of a mindset shift, at least in the immediate aftermath of deliberative mini-publics. So what can we take from this? More deliberative mini-publics. It might seem like a fairly obvious point to make, but I think what's interesting in the context of the DMPs is while we accorded a very central role to experts, their role was primarily communication. They didn't actually take part in that final deliberative phase. So if you want to upscale these or do another series of deliberative mini-public oriented experiments, potentially you could accord them a greater role in the final phase of deliberative mini-publics, whereby they look at some of the vagaries and some of the issues around policies and kind of discuss them and try to come to some sort of solution or consensus. Also, examination of legacy media as a potential platform for scientific debate. It's a thorny issue, but we can't ignore it because it came up. There is a need to address existing deficiencies in current orbit transport systems, unsurprisingly, to encourage greater modal shift. Also, people did wish to see greater public consultation and transport decision-making at the local level as well. County councils cropped up quite a bit in the final deliberative phase. And that concludes things. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Simon and Finbarr, for that really interesting presentation. I might just ask our panel to maybe sit at the front so we can hear our thoughts and feedback. So if you want to just stand out there, and Shane and Anne to take a seat here. And we might just invite Anne to kick off if you don't mind, or I don't mind. Shane, do you want to go first?
I'll leave it to Shane.
Yeah, sure. Shane, that's fine. Shane, if you wouldn't mind just giving us, 4 or 5 minutes of reaction to the slides, and then we'll also ask Anne to give her response. And of course, our presenters can react to the comments from that Anne and Shane want to offer, and then we'll open it up to the wider floor for questions and answers. So Shane, without further ado, you can take off and give us your thoughts on that.
Sure, yeah, I'll try to keep this to 4 or 5 minutes. So it's really impressive work and really interesting findings. I will caveat what I'm about to say by saying that I'm not an expert in kind of qualitative analysis. So what I do would be on the more quantitative side, but it is then really let's get that triangulation of methods. So kind of findings that we get at the quant side, seeing them sort of replicated and expanded on in the qualitative side when you hear from members of the public is really interesting and helpful. So some thoughts I had, I was trying to kind of group them there listening to the presentation. The first I think is probably most obvious is the importance of communication in it. So I think it was striking that the journalist came across as the one that people were most favorable towards, and that's the one who's trained in communication. So the one who was trained in how to communicate with the public was the one that kind of managed to get the message across. One thing that kind of struck me with what came out in the findings was that emphasis on sort of the accessibility of public transport and the fairness in the expectation that I'm supposed to change my behaviour. So from a behavioural science perspective, that's something we consider from what we call a kind of collective action framework. So behavioural economics findings that if you want people to kind of make those sacrifices in order to benefit the larger, the greater good, fairness is going to be key there. So there's perceptions of fairness in terms of processes and in the distribution of the effects. So that kind of is what struck me listening to the findings. The other thing on the communication side that was quite interesting is that notion of psychological distance. So as a psychologist, we've been talking about the psychological distance of climate change for quite a while, to the extent now that we've been talking about it for so long that it's probably no longer accurate because it's gotten much scientifically closer to us, the repercussions of climate change. So I think there's an effort there needs to be made to better communicate to the public that this is a now problem and it's a here problem, not a distant one. But that's, I think, a challenge for scientists because so attribution science obviously has improved massively, but as a scientist, you always want to communicate with caution. You want to kind of give all the caveats. You don't want to say that this is definitely caused by climate change. So that's I think a balance that needs to be struck. In terms of the solutions, one thing that I thought was interesting is that notion that scientists are responsible for the solution. So it nearly seems like it's people relying on the technological solution that's going to solve it, and not so much recognition of the onus on the individual and how they interact with systems in order to bring about the systems change that's needed. So that's quite interesting. And then I'll try to finish up with a point about the response that people had to the third language, which I don't know the content of what was said in all of them, but it seemed to me that the expert that proposed the most specific solutions is the one that received the most negativity or the most resistance. So you're getting that kind of resistance to the specific proposal changes and not so much in the abstract, we're okay with this change, but not this specific policy. So some work that we're doing for the NTA relevant for that is on status quo bias. So why people resist change, and from findings that we have there, it suggests that proposing a change to people makes them immediately start to think about what might go wrong. Even if in an alternative world, they would have really liked this outcome or this to have been in place initially. Motivated reasoning as well is going to kind of, that's another where people kind of dislike an outcome, they'll use that to kind of color maybe the process or the person that's coming from. And then lastly, that kind of appeal to emotions fits with the sort of psychological framework, what we call like system 1 versus system 2, where if you want to kind of appeal to someone or get them on board with something, you appeal to their system 1, the intuitive, the emotional, and then follow that up with the system 2, not going with the facts and figures first, which again, I think a communications challenge for scientists who want to lead with the charts and so on. I have plenty of other thoughts, but I'm going to pass over to Anna.
Thanks so much, Shane. Really interested, especially from the psychological behavioural angle. And we're really keen to hear your thoughts as well, of course.
And of course, I come from the practical implementation side of things as an engineer and as a civil engineer, and our organisation is very much focused on implementation of government policy in relation to sustainable transport. But we're increasingly, I suppose, relying on behavioural science to assist us in trying to ensure that we, in our developing our messages, are able to, I suppose, sell our what we're delivering in terms of active travel in particular, but also about using public transport. So I think this research is really, really interesting, very important for us in terms of how we go forward in terms of our consultation and the type of consultations we do in the future. But I was just wondering, you know, when you looked at the different expertise, where us as an organisation are placed, you know, we wouldn't be considered necessarily in the experts side of the scientists, even though we have a lot of expertise in the organisation. We're obviously not in the media side, but are we associated with the NGO side? I'm not sure, you know, and maybe because we do come forward with individual kind of projects, you know, post policy, we probably are falling into that NGO in terms of the way the public respond to some of our projects. But it certainly given me a food for thought in terms of how we should be presenting our expertise, and maybe if we present it in a much more to build up the trust in terms of the expertise, will that help us then when we go to implementation? But I just wonder, there might be a feeling that, well, we're too invested in the implementation really, and there might be, you know, a little bit of that we're building in bias, or that we can't be trusted on our own expertise. But one of the things then I thought, just in terms of communications on climate change and transport, is like in 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been mentioning climate change related to public transport and the improvement of public transport. And the association now with, you know, what we have to deliver from a climate perspective, is that colouring people's response to what we need to do, just, you know, in terms of ensuring that we have good movement and we can meet the demand for transport, you know, to grow the economy. Like, is attaching what we're trying to do from a transport perspective, from an emissions perspective, actually changing people's response to what we're proposing. So almost, you know, the question will be asked, well, do we drop the climate? You know, because the climate emergency thing is not necessarily bringing more people to actually amend their behaviour. That's just a very open question. I don't know that I'm not qualified enough to talk about that, but it was just interesting to see the response. And the response in terms of the individual actions that were brought by the NGOs, I thought was interesting, because you know, the response to active travel, yes, people want more active travel, they definitely do from a conceptual point of view, but if it's outside their front door and if it's removing their access to parking, then that completely changes. Interesting as well about the trust in the media. I think that's very important for Ireland as a country, that we do have trustworthy media, and that people do use the established media to receive their information, a lot more so than social media. And then, you know, I could nearly probably hear who that individual was that was presented. I probably could make a couple of guesses. And then I also, the particular media that that person might work for, which kind of sometimes works against us when we're trying to deliver a piece of infrastructure. But I think it's still very important as a country that we are invested in our media in terms of a trusted source of information. So they were just some of my initial kind of responses. But
Thanks very much, Anne. That's really, really interesting. I'm not sure whether Finbarr or Simon want to respond to our panelists first before we just open it up to wider questions from the floor.
Yeah, I think your point about expertise is really interesting, because when people think about expertise, they tend to latch on to the scientific, technical aspect of expertise, but also implementation science is something that's increasingly coming on stream, particularly in the health sciences.
Yeah.
So how to actually put together, for instance, a risk communication campaign, how to align stakeholders, how to scale up. So I think this is something that is coming into the public awareness more and more. I think also, you mentioned that for the NGO, for instance, I think it's an interesting point to make that given the contestation that was naturally going to arise from some of their proposals, it was probably an inevitability that there would be the most outcry relation to that particular expert and what they propounded. But I think it's encouraging that we did see some support on some small, albeit small, changes in mindset as well, which I think is very interesting as well. And also in terms of how you actually evaluate a particular sector, I think it depends on how you adjust the spotlight. For instance, when we talk about government, so are we talking about, and that's a word no one wants to hear, but quangos? Are we talking about government agencies? Are we talking about departments? People have different conceptions as to what a sector actually is. When a lot of people mention governments in the final deliberative phase of the DMPs, they included local authorities in that particular frame of reference. And there was also an interesting enough desire for more local consultation at the local level. There was a feeling that local authorities were somewhat out in limbo and not as involved as they could be. So the supervision aspect as well. So I think it's very important also to acknowledge how people actually perceive stakeholders and perceive experts, and what their sectors actually encompass. Yeah. I think.
Yeah, but just add that what came out in the deliberations was certainly that car dependency is embedded culturally in what we do in society. That came out quite strongly across the different tables, but that there is an intergenerational divide. So some of the quotes among the older participants, "You will never get me out of my car."
Yeah.
There's some of these where the younger people much more willing to change in terms of their behaviour and take other active modes on transport. So there's a couple of things coming out of it.